Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for dedicating your time to myths, mysteries, and majesty. And I'm especially excited and thankful for tonight because we have one of the celebrities, if I can speak in a good context, in a good meaning of Christianity. We have our brother apologist, Erik Manning, for tonight. Erik, welcome. How is everything with you? And thank you for finding time for us.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it. I don't know if I'd consider myself a celebrity. It must be a pretty small pond I'm swimming in here if that's the case. But no, I appreciate it, and yeah, looking forward to discussing these important topics with you.
Yeah, before we start, I just want to say that Eric and I will be primarily discussing when it comes to the historical reliability of the Gospels, since we both thought that this will be a very important topic, not just for skeptics who have genuine questions, and this is perfectly fine, but also with Christians who may be doubting how the Bible came to be, what is the canon of the Bible, what are maybe these books that we have included, but also even more importantly, how are these things corresponding with sources and documents, especially when it comes to secular documents that we have from the history. Eric, before we start diving in with this, I just have a first question. Why are so many Christians disinterested in theology, including apologetics? Could it be that our clergy is not doing a very well job in explaining to the audience and to their church members why is the apologetics so important for us today?
Yeah, I mean, I don't fully know the answer to that question, although I would say that like if you don't see the importance of apologetics, it's probably because you're just not doing evangelism. And I know that might be a tough criticism for some, but if you're not out there talking to people, you're not going to hear the objections that they have, and and so therefore you're not really being exposed to some of the questions that people have. Um, Unfortunately, it's just kind of too common for people to think that like that's just kind of heady, and we don't do that kind of stuff here. Some churches, I'm not saying all churches by any stretch of the imagination, but it's just kind of looked upon as like this strange thing that's not really impacting a whole lot of people. But I'm a counselor for a ministry called Talk About Doubts, besides my own YouTube channel that I run, Testify. And yeah, I'm talking to Christians all the time who are being hit with all kinds of objections regarding the reliability of the scriptures, the resurrection, miracles. And it's not just because they heard their college professor or somebody, try and tear apart the Bible. It's something that they heard on TikTok. It's something that they heard on YouTube. There's so much content that's out there today. And there are atheists who are unabashedly evangelistic about not only have they deconstructed their own faith, but they want you to do the same thing. And it seems like we're just not really meeting their level. Unfortunately, I hate to say this, but a lot of the popular Christian YouTube channels are more interested in, I don't know, what celebrities think, or their favorite false teacher that they want to hear their favorite teacher debunk. Um, but and I'm not saying there's not a place for exposing false teaching, but I don't know. It's just a lot of shallowness, I guess. But anyways, I'm probably getting off on a soapbox a little bit there, but yeah, there are plenty of atheistic YouTube channels, TikTok channels, all this social media who, like I said, are enthusiastic about the Bible and deconstructing it, but I don't feel like we meet that same level. Why that is exactly, I would like to know the answer to that myself. I don't know. But it is kind of frustrating, and it's just kind of a burden that I take to try and fill that vacuum a little bit.
Yeah, thank you for that. Um, Eric, we all know about this shocking statistics how a number of youth in our churches are simply abandoning the faith because their college professors or their friends and the secular media has informed that how the Bible is false. You can't trust the word of God. There is no God. You can be whoever you want to be, etc. Would you share or not that that number of people who deconvert and who abandon Christianity, that number would be significantly less if we, as the global church, pastors, priests, parents, but also as individuals. If we would do a better job in teaching this stuff, explaining what is apologetics, defending the faith, and teaching children some stuff that they're like maybe theologically heavy, so to speak, but that will contribute to their mental, their cognitive, their spiritual, their theological growth. So once when we let them go, so to speak, into colleges, jobs, and when they form their families, they'll be much more. They'll have deeper foundation, and they'll know how to combat these attacks and grow in Christ instead of abandoning.
I mean, yeah, sure. I would say that it's up to the local church. It's up to the pastors to some extent. It's up to the parents. Really, if you're going to parent your kids in this day and age, again, it's not so much. I hear it a lot, like pastors cautioning people about sending their kids to secular colleges because they're going to come across, the Bart Ehrmans of the world who want to challenge their faith. But really, again, the Bart Ehrmans of the room are trying to come into your living room through a lot of these different channels. You know what I mean? And so, yeah, I think it starts with parents. I think it starts with pastors. I think that when people look at apologetics, maybe it's daunting because it involves learning philosophy, it involves learning history, could involve learning some scientific background. But not everybody has to be like the jack of all trades in apologetics. What you really just need to be able to know is who the experts are and to be able to point people to those experts. You should be able to at least, you don't have to master it all yourself if you're a pastor, although I think you should have an interest, especially historical apologetics, because our faith is historical to begin with and it's rooted in history. And so we should just by nature, by default, as Christians, be interested, at least to some degree. But yeah, at least know who the experts are, at least be able to point people to that, at least be able to invite, apologists into your church to speak, or at least be able to point people to, the appropriate books, podcasts, YouTube channels, blogs, all that kind of stuff as a bare minimum. Just be aware of who they are, because again, we all have different parts. We're all have different graces and different abilities according to what God has given us. But so we're not going to all be able to be, William Lane Craig or N.T. Wright or Peter J. Williams or whoever, but at least be able to know who those people are and point people to them.
Yeah, thank you. I think these couple questions served well as warming up for the main topic, and that is the Gospels. Erik, can you please give us a general overview, theme, message of the Gospels, but also something including dating and as well as who are the authors of the Gospels?
Oh, sure. Well, I mean, that's a really broad question, but I mean, as far as the overall message of the Gospels, obviously it centers on, and I think you see this in Acts 2, that these books purport to be witness accounts, or at least, derived from eyewitnesses who witnessed the ministry, the life, teaching, and ministry of Jesus, and most importantly, his resurrection. And so that would be kind of the message there. Besides the teachings, the resurrection, the miracles kind of confirm the message. And these purport to be historical, right? They purport to be something. Even when I was a skeptic, as like an atheist, when I was reading these books, just being open to the possibility that I might be wrong, I just thought, well, is this folklore? Is this just made up kind of stuff? Like, okay, I understand the teaching part and what Jesus is teaching sounds historical, but these miracles, like, is this just like some other form of parable or something like that? But I couldn't get away that at least they were purporting to report history and what actually happened in the past. And so I believe that the Gospels were written by either apostles, as Justin Martyr describes them. Justin Martyr was a Christian apologist who wrote around the year 150. He said that the Gospels were memoirs of the apostles, or those who are basically companions of the apostles, and I'm just paraphrasing. Well, if you think about that description, even though Justin doesn't actually name who the four gospel authors are, You got Matthew, who's a disciple. There's at least disciples who wrote the Gospels. Well, we have two, and then he says companions. Well, that means there's at least two. Well, we have four Gospels, obviously, who were written by companions, Matthew and John, of Jesus, and traveling companions of apostles, companions of the apostles. So you have Mark, the who was a traveling companion of Peter and like kind of his scribe, according to church history. And then, of course, Luke, who traveled with Paul. And we can defend, there's multiple reasons to think that like whoever wrote Luke Acts was absolutely a traveling companion of Paul. And so those are the writers. We find out Irenaeus discusses who they are. He names them Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. He's the first one to name all four of them together. And so skeptics are like, well, man, that's a long time afterwards. But actually, they're named earlier than that. I mean, Papias names Matthew and Mark. The Muratorian Canon around 170, maybe past 200, also names the same guys. He names Luke and John, I believe. And there are a number of other church fathers who will name either John, or even heretics that will name John, which is kind of interesting. Or they'll name some of the other people. You have as I said earlier, Justin Martyr talks about their companions of the gospel, companions of the apostles or apostles themselves, and their memoirs. He had a student named Tatian who wrote a harmony of the gospels called the Diatessaron. Well, Diatessaron means through four, and it's a harmony of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And so overall, I think we have ample evidence from all the manuscript data that we have, and then all the early church fathers say who wrote the Gospels. And that's just the way that we normally would do history when we're trying to attribute authorship to ancient documents, right? And that's just the way we do it. So yeah, that's who wrote them. I believe there are internal clues there. It's a whole big discussion and debate, obviously, with who wrote the Gospels. And maybe we could talk about that more. As far as dating goes, I mean, you mentioned dating. I can touch on a few things. Again, these are broad topics that we could do almost an entire show on. Most scholars will date Mark to 70, Luke and John, or excuse me, Matthew and Luke to 80, 85, and John somewhere to 90, 95. I tend to date the Gospels a little bit earlier than that, mostly because I believe that Luke used Mark's Gospel, and Luke follows Paul around, in all of these different court scenes in the book of Acts. And we know that whoever wrote Acts is also the person who wrote Luke. And so before Acts comes Luke, and before Luke comes Mark. Well, Luke, again, like I said, he's following around Paul. He's very interested in all these court scenes over and over and over again. But yet when we get to his big court scene with Caesar, his whole date with Caesar, we get nothing. Some might say, well, you're making an argument from silence, Eric, but no, I'm actually making an argument from the very purpose of the book. And so it seems as if the author of Acts was in a hurry to get the book to his dedicatee, Theophilus, his patron, likely. And this was before Paul actually dies and before he even goes before Caesar. So it was probably around 62 AD. So that would make Luke probably late 50s, maybe early 60s, like very early 60s. And that would make Mark probably 50s. Even Maurice Casey and James Crossley, who are atheist New Testament scholars, will date Mark in the 40s for what it's worth. So I do think that they were early. There's arguments for Matthew being early as well, but we don't have to get into that. Basically, if you could just establish this part, then you have earlier Gospels than what they would say. As far as John goes, it could be late, that late date. To me, the more interesting question isn't so much when the Gospels are dated, but are they actually reliable? Because you could have an early book, but if it's not written by reliable witnesses, then big whoop-de-doo. What I care about is, at least, are they written within living memory? And there's ample evidence that what we have in the Gospels shows that they're written by people who are close up to the facts, very interested in the truth, and are scrupulous, and are very knowledgeable people. And if that's the case, then what they're reporting goes to what the original eyewitnesses were claiming.
Yeah, but let's say even that John is, really late. I mean, still, the date of his gospel comes before the first century ended, correct?
Right. Yeah. And if you look at the Gospel of John, it sure seems like he has like a vivid memory. He's kind of like got a photographic memory. He talks about like, there were 6 water pots that were 20 to 30 gallons each. He talks about when they're rowing across the Sea of Galilee. It's like, it says that they went like, I forget the exact measurement, but like so many, like 10 to 15 something or other across the lake. After the resurrection, he's like, there was 153 fish that we caught. And he talks about all these different very specific times in the 10th hour and the first hour, and lots of different things like that, that kind of show an eye of a beholder and somebody who has like a very good and vivid memory. Some people will push back and say, well, Eric, come on, of course you're going to put realistic details in your gospels to, in something, if you're trying to lie. Well, yeah, but again, that just pushes it back to, at least he's purporting to write history. We know that the whole genre of modern historical fiction wasn't something that was invented until many, many years later. And if you compare his details to, say, I don't know, the Acts of John, the Acts of Paul and Thecla, some of the apocryphal gospels, you don't really see quite that high level, high resolution detail. But it's not just those kind of details. There's also all kinds of other ways that John and the other gospel writers are corroborated by historical facts. They corroborate one another in very unplanned and undesigned ways that have the ring of truth. There's many, many different lines of evidence that show that these are written by eyewitnesses that we could talk about and give specific details if you like.
Yeah, we can try later if we have enough time. That's a good topic.
Mhm.
Well, subtopic. I just want to say how I love uh, that even secular historians consider Luke to be the first class historian. They don't necessarily have to believe what he wrote, but they marvel his work with such that he did with such professionalism, details, things that only a true professional, if I can put it with that in those words, historian would do. And for me, that's amazing. And just another of those little evidences that, like, yeah, like, obviously Luke paid attention because this was so important to him. It wasn't just if it was just a fairy tale or something that was intentionally exaggerated, it wouldn't be with so many details. So for me, once when I found out that Luke was and still is so highly esteemed, even in the among secular scholars, that was so impressive to me.
Yeah, I mean, you'll get some pushback to that these days. But usually that's from biblical critics who are looking at these documents kind of different. But when you get to some like classical historians, like Colin Hemmer, A.N. Sherwin White, different people like that, they will marvel at Luke's accuracy in small details. So yeah, I totally agree with you. And actually, like I alluded to with some of these biblical critics who look at Luke as if he's just kind of, writing fiction, it's some of their arguments are absolutely ridiculous. But you're right. I mean, they do get tons of Luke does get tons of little details right. I mean, for example, one thing that I think is kind of interesting is it talks about in Acts 27 the whole shipwreck of St. Paul, and it talks about there being this south wind that comes up, and they weighed anchor. They began sailing along Crete and shore, and there was this violent wind, Euraculo. I hope I'm saying that right. And when the ship was caught in it, they could not face the wind, and it gave way. And it says they ran under the shelter to a small island called Cauda. Now, what's kind of interesting about this is Cauda is more than 20 miles west-southwest of where the storm likely struck the travelers in the Bay of Massara. But this is actually precisely where the trajectory of a northeaster would have carried them, according to all the meteorological data that we actually can cross-check. And what's interesting is this isn't the sort of information that somebody would have inferred without being carried there themselves. And we have Ptolemy and Pliny the Elder, who tried to locate this tiny island of Cauda outside of Crete, and they got it like way wrong in all of their, they're mapping it out and all this other stuff. The one ancient historian that we actually have that gets the correct location of this tiny island is Luke. And there are, like I said, dozens and dozens of other examples that I can give like that. As far as like local titles, Luke gets tons of local titles right. Like he gets the proper designation for the magistrates of the colony in Acts 17 called Strategoi. This is the particular colony that he was at in Philippi. He gets the proper term for the local officials in Thessalonica, the magistrates there, which is polytarchs. The term Areopagites comes from Areospagos. I might be butchering some of my pronunciations here, but this is the correct title for somebody who's a court of Athens. He correctly identifies Gallio as the proconsul, and we actually have an inscription from archaeology of Gallio that was discovered at the Temple of Apollo. And there's just the title Publius as the first man of the island. We have inscriptional data that confirms that this is actually the right title of the local official, the head, kind of the head honcho in Malta. It just on and on and on and on it goes. And so, it seems to me like whoever wrote Acts, which again I believe is Luke, definitely knew his stuff. And I think this is better explained by him being a traveling companion of Paul than just being, some guy who, it's not like they had Wikipedia back then, right? It's not like they had local libraries even that they could just kind of, let's get all this information. And so the amount of detail, and again, historical modern fiction wasn't a genre that really existed yet. And if you're not impressed with this, just go read the Acts of John, read the Acts of Paul, read the Acts of Paul and Thecla, read the Acts of Thomas, and do a comparison. Acts of Thomas gets like, there's a guy in India named King Gundusphorus. Okay, well, big whoop-de-doo. Like, it's not that difficult to know who the king was, right? Where he knows about like rickshaws. Okay, like again, if you've been to India, that's fine. These are minuscule, obscure details that are difficult to get right without the aid of Wikipedia or libraries, and he couldn't look these up. And there are other details like that where Luke or Acts dovetails with Paul's letters. That we could discuss. They're pretty amazing too. That just bolster the case that he really was a traveling companion with Paul. And if he traveled with Paul, then when Paul was in jail in Jerusalem, he would have been able to be there with him, and he would have had access to other eyewitnesses. And we know that Luke talks about in his prologue that he interviews eyewitnesses, that he's interested in finding out who the witnesses are, who these ministers of the word, and getting their testimony. So anyway, I kind of went off on that for a bit there, but that's just a little bit of a taste. Luke Acts is like a really fascinating topic to me. So.
No, I enjoyed every second because I love learning, and when I have someone on the channel who is so knowledgeable like you in some area, I love listening and learning because I think it only helps my faith, since my faith is not blind, and I always like to learn more facts about the faith. You mentioned earlier some classical authors, and I wanted to correlate. I want to parallel with that word classical compared to the works of classics, especially the Greek and Roman classics. Our copies of the New Testament Gospels are vast, much more vast. We have over 6,000 Greek manuscripts to this day, and this is what Christian apologists call the embarrassment of riches, right? Uh, I love the work and the ministry of Dr. Daniel Wallace, and how he goes. Well, he's a bit older now, but how his team goes throughout the Europe and Middle East and finds all these manuscripts and takes them in digital form, and they're all available to be seen online for free. So I just want to say, to encourage Christians, just know that we have over 6,000 Greek manuscripts to this day. They occasionally find few of those. Um, that should encourage you, knowing that all these manuscripts are coming from different families, and correct, when the scholars compare them, they find some differences, But as scholars are saying and theologians, that 99% of our theology is not affected by any of those discrepancies found when all those families of the Greek manuscripts are compared. Another so cool thing would be I didn't know, but the very canon of the New Testament was started to being compiled by the church because they bumped into this heretic from the early second century whose name was Marcion. He was codifying, collecting the books in his canon, but because he was so biased and he was spreading heresy that the God of the Old Testament is not the God of the New Testament, he saw the God of the New Testament or Jesus's father as much loving deity. So in his canon of he completely rejected the Old Testament, but in the New Testament, he accepted only, I think, 10 or 11 books. It was the Gospel of Luke, and then shorter versions of the epistles, which he heavily edited. And because of that, he was excommunicated from the church I have data here, in AD 144 as a heretic. But unfortunately, to this day, we have people who still believe that God of the Old Testament is not the same as the God of the New Testament. And based on Marcion, this is why this heresy is still called based on him to this day. Erik, I was wondering if there's anything you would like to say about this, but also another small sub question, if I can call it that way. What is in your practice of reading and studying the Bible the best way to deal with discrepancies? Because in one gospel you can see, oh, there are like two people. In another gospel you can see, oh, maybe there are like three eyewitnesses. We see all these authors of the gospels paying attention to different details. So what is in your experience, what is the best way to deal with these so-called discrepancies or differences in the gospel accounts?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, we could talk about discrepancies. First, you touched on a lot of different things there, and we can get back to some of those too. As far as discrepancies go, I would just say that we have numerous confirmation points that the gospel authors were trying to get it right. Like some of the examples that I gave you just right now from the book of Acts. Okay. There are numerous examples like that also in the gospels. There are numerous instances where, say, a gospel author makes an unexplained allusion to something that kind of raises a question, that another gospel author goes in and explains, but he does it in a way that's completely undesigned. And it has the ring of truth in the sense that it looks like they're just two people telling the same story, but they interlock in a way that they're not trying to fill in the detail for the other person, right? Which is a mark of truth. And maybe we can go through some examples of that. Because there are so many of those kind of instances where they just undesignedly, are corroborated either with each other or with secular history. That means, again, that they're probably close up to the facts, knowledgeable, and they're trying to get things right. Now, in any time you're dealing with eyewitness testimony, there's going to be some discrepancies. There's going to be apparent contradictions. And so it's not really a bug, it's a feature of eyewitness testimony, that's what you're going to have. And so contradictions don't really count as strongly against historical reliability as some of the facts that I would bring forward in making a positive case. And so you can't just look at contradictions in a vacuum. You have to look at the whole cumulative case for the historical reliability of the text. Then you have to consider maybe if there was a contradiction, but it was like a good faith error, a mistake, that might change us. That might cause us to rethink some of our theology regarding how we view inerrancy or if we are still inerrantist or whatever. But it wouldn't undermine the core historical data that we have, right? It wouldn't undermine our case really if there was a good faith error, if there was a good faith mistake, right? Now, that being said, you hear scholars like Bart Ehrman who say, well, the Gospels are hopelessly contradictory, and there's just dozens and dozens and dozens of these contradictions, and so there's no way they could be eyewitness testimony. Well, for that person, I would say, go ahead, buy yourself a copy of Jesus Interrupted, and go through. Is it Jesus Interrupted, or am I thinking of a different book? all of a sudden, maybe it is Jesus interrupted. My brain just went sideways here. I'll double check while we're talking here. But just go through his book and then actually read the text for yourselves, and you'll see that a lot of times the contradictions that like scholars like Bart Ehrman bring forward are just garbage. They're just ridiculous. So, for example, Bart says that like Matthew was so desperate to have Jesus fulfill prophecy that he misread something in Zechariah 9, and he had Jesus straddling two donkeys like some sort of rodeo clown during the triumphal entry. Well, if you actually look at Matthew 21:7, I'll read you the verse here and how he gets that. One second here. It says, they brought the donkey and the colt, and they placed their cloaks and sat upon them, or they placed their cloaks on them for Jesus to sit on. That's the NIV. Let me find the new American Standard here, a different translation. Yeah, they brought the donkey and the colt, laid their clothes on them, and set him on them. All right. Sorry, I'm gonna try that again here. He sat on them is basically what the way that it reads in the Greek. And so, yeah, here we go. This is the NET. They brought the donkey and the colt, and they placed their cloaks on them, and he sat on them, right? Well, what's the antecedent of them? Well, you could read it as he sat on two donkeys, but he could also read it as he sat on the cloaks. If you have any sort of charitable bone in your body, you would probably think, is Matthew an idiot? Does he think that Jesus, how did he do this, right? Did he strap them together? What's going on here? And so there's just kind of silly stuff that Ehrman does in order to generate contradictions like that are just kind of silly. And so if you could just like read the text for yourselves, like I said, and just think about it and not just take his word for it, a lot of times these contradictions will fall apart. Now, I do think there are a handful of things in the Gospels that really do look like contradictions that I might not know exactly how to resolve. But again, as I already stated, if that's all we have, that's not enough to undermine that these guys are trying to tell us the truth. And at worst, they made like a good faith mistake. It's not this hopelessly contradictory situation. Now, I could go through other, goofy examples of contradictions that Ehrman raises if you want. But if you look at them, a lot of them are just ridiculous readings, perverse kind of like harmonization where he tries to put two things together. He cherry picks to create developments. He says things like, I don't know, there's this anti-Semitic trajectory from Mark all the way to John. That's not even true. And again, we can go through some of these examples if you like, but yeah, when you just actually read Ehrman, it's kind of like, dude, you're either incompetent or you're dishonest, because like some of these examples that you're bringing forward are just like really, really bad. Does that make sense?
It does. Thank you for mentioning Ehrman and some of the examples. I remember in my younger days when I heard about these things, and again, I'm not coming from a Christian home. I was raised as agnostic. In my early 20s, I started investigating. People were sharing the gospel with me, and then I decided, if this is true, let me find out more. But even when I became a believer, I wasn't reading books. I wasn't into material knowledge, facts. I didn't know much. And then little by little, I will hear about all these good, smart, atheist objections, and it always bugged me that I wasn't able to find a good reason by myself of why do I believe ABC. So then I started investigating and learning more, and eventually I learned what apologetics is. I didn't know always. And when I was listening to some apologists, specifically when it comes to this idea of so-called discrepancies in the gospel accounts, I remember that my heart calmed down once when I learned that these are not discrepancies at all. It was basically as if, for example, you as Erik are paying attention to, let's say, a sport event, and you're writing the whole essay, and then they ask me to write an essay. There'll be many similar things that we mentioned, but there'll be many details that you mention and I don't mention, and vice versa. And I learned over time that these are not contradictions. These are just uh, the things, the details that me as my with my personality and my character, I paid attention to more, and that's why I include them in my writings, opposing the way God made you as Eric, as yourself as individual, that you paid attention to certain details. So these things in the court of law actually would help if we would be both invited to the court of law and there is a case of some criminal activity, and you will say, yes, I saw two people, and they will say, well, wait, Eric, you were further, I saw three people. That's not a contradiction. And we see a lot of these things in the Gospels. Rather, you saw two people from your angle, but I was closer. Maybe the third person was in the car laying down, and because I was closer, I was able to see him or her, but you didn't. And these are not contradictions. Once when I learned this, a lot of weight fell off my shoulder. Of course, over time, another more challenging questions and topics came, and I always wanted to be the one who is buying books, reading articles. I'm always thirsty and hungry for more knowledge and more answers. And this topic helped me not to see these things as discrepancies. Bart Ehrman also loves to point there are close to 500,000 of discrepancies or differences between all those 6,000 and maybe close to 500 Greek manuscripts. Yeah, if you don't give any details and any background, that seems horrible. Like we should all abandon our faith. Are you telling me there are close to 500,000 of mistakes or differences between the Greek manuscripts? Then how can we have confidence we have the proper word of God? But then you have Christian apologists who come and say, hey, you're not telling the whole story. 99 of those differences are just misspelling, grammar mistakes, because the scribes 2,000 years ago, they didn't have electricity. They would fall asleep. They would misspell the word. They would sometimes write another letter twice, or would just omit the same thing with words. So most of the discrepancies are merely grammar. There are a few complex and more challenging passages in the New Testament where Christian scholars agree or disagree, and they debate with each other. But none of these things are make us doubt the most fundamental doctrines of the Christianity, which are the Trinity, Jesus' divinity, Jesus' incarnation, and so forth. So for me, this brings me a lot of comfort and confidence. Do you feel the same?
I mean, yeah, sure. I think as far as the manuscript stuff goes, Bart Ehrman himself says, and this is in one of the earlier editions of Misquoting Jesus, page 252. He says, the position I argue for in misquoting Jesus does not actually stand at odds with Professor Metzger's position. Professor Metzger was his doctoral dissertation supervisor. They also co-wrote a book together. He says that the essential Christian beliefs are not affected by textual variants in the manuscript tradition of the New Testament. And so even Ehrman himself admits this. And so, again, the way that I kind of look at it is like, with all the different manuscripts, yeah, we have a bunch of manuscripts. I don't want to oversell it. Like most of the manuscripts that we have are older. But I don't think that most people really question whether or not we have the text. I know that Ehrman's whole book, Misquoting Jesus, is kind of to cast some shade on that. But at the same time, he just talks about he just focuses on a few meaningful variants that he thinks are important, but ultimately, like you said, don't affect any Christian beliefs overall, unless you're like a snake handling Pentecostal church or something like that. If you think that's essential. So no, I don't really think that that's a super important issue. Again, it goes back to, we could have tons and tons of manuscripts, but what is in the manuscripts? Are they historically reliable? Are they trustworthy? Are they written by eyewitnesses or people that we don't even know who they are, far, far away, long after the events, who might have been telling us some things that were real and embellishing a bunch of other details? And that's the skeptical view of the Gospels in a nutshell. Whereas I'm saying, no, we know who the authors are. We know that they're written within living memory of the apostles. And we have all kinds of small indicators that build up a cumulative case that show that what's being written actually does go back to what the original eyewitnesses said. And when you look at the big list of supposed contradictions, they're really just a handful of ones that are kind of interesting. So yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah, it surely does. I remember we covering this topic on my Bible intro class at Moody Bible Institute. I truly enjoyed this class because we were going through, things that we are discussing tonight. And again, I enjoyed the class so much. Eric, I was thinking about switching to the second major uh, area of our topic for tonight,
Okay.
and this is how do atheists see the gospel? Could it be that all of them see them as 100% fiction, that Jesus never existed, or if there is more complexity, and if there may be subgroups among even the atheists themselves who would say, well, no, maybe he did exist, but he surely wasn't divine.
Yeah, I mean, I think the scholarly consensus, which I don't really care about, to be honest. And we could talk about that if you want, but the scholarly consensus would probably say that like we do have some historical information so that we can mine out of the Gospels, and that do go back to, you know, events or sayings of Jesus. And so there are some fringe people out there that are growing more loud on the internet, but are nonetheless still pretty fringy, that want to say, no, this is just mythology. They're just copying pagan legends, Roman legends, Greco-Roman myths, different things like that. I think the case that I can make completely undermines all of that. But what most atheists will say, they're partially true and they're partially embellished. And I think if they're being honest, and some of them are honest, um, their big hangup is miracles, and the miracles that are recorded in them. Now, they'll also say, no, there's contradictions and there's just historical errors and different things like that. And so they can't go back to eyewitnesses. But I really think that the major stumbling block is a philosophical one. It might be kind of bold of me to say, and some of them might bristle at that. But I mean, again, a lot of them, when they're being honest, like Gerd Ludemann, who's a New Testament scholar, says the whole idea of the resurrection is ludicrous. You know, D.F. Strauss, who's the modern father of biblical criticism, just he was very upfront and just like the idea of miracles is ludicrous. If you hear kids in the background, I apologize. There's not much I can do about that.
Yeah, we hear them, but that's okay.
My nephews are over, and I have
They
5
bring
kids
joy.
visiting.
They bring
Yeah,
joy. Like Jesus said, let him come to me. So that's
let them come. Yeah. So, but yeah, I think a lot of it goes back to miracles, and I think that's why they'll generate contradictions where a lot of times there aren't any, because they're trying to undermine historicity, because they just kind of start with this preconceived philosophical belief that like miracles are bunk, they don't happen, that's silly, we're modern scientific people, come on now. And that's where I would bring in stories of modern miracles that happen in, today. I think you talked to my friend Caleb Jackson, maybe some about that in a previous episode. So I would definitely recommend people go back and watch that. If that's true, well, I think that should cause us to reconsider, if those are even possibly true, it should cause us to reconsider the way that we look at the text and maybe not be so cynical.
Yeah, I just want to say a couple of things about this. My next question would be, well, it was, what are the common objections that atheists bring? And you just answered even before I ask you about miracles. It's funny because when I watch YouTube debates with Christians and non-Christians, or when Christians are, invited to speak to a college campus, and then you have, Christians and non-Christians waiting in the line to ask questions. And I love when people are honest. It doesn't matter if they're religious or not. And I'm shocked that atheists and skeptics who come and say honestly, there's literally nothing that can convince me that Jesus is God, that Bible is true, that your version of God is true. There's nothing that will make me convert. And you're left to think, well, then I'm done with my job. I don't. I said what I thought it would be good and true and historical for me to tell you. But up to this point, I think it's more not just intellectual. Now it's merely emotional reason and response to the person who rejects everything, because it becomes Suddenly, when we go to the historical reliability of the Gospels, apologetics, suddenly the topic, once when you put all their cards as a Christian out, and once when you tell them about the fine-tuned argument, the theological argument, column, how the Bible came to be, all these things, when you tell them, if they still reject, now you see that suddenly emotional response happens, and it's more like, oh, God hates the homosexuals. Oh, there was slavery in the Old Testament. So now suddenly it's not this anymore, but they suddenly switch to another topic, and you see that the problem with many people, and I was one of them, so I don't hate them, I can sympathize with them. The problem with many people is not just here, but it's also here. So I just wanted to ask you, for you as an apologist, if you encounter many cases like that.
I'm different. I don't try and mind read people too much, or if I do, I keep it to myself. I find a lot of atheist counter apologists. Sorry for the noise again. They just want to like put you in the psychologist chair and be like, you just need a crutch, or this, that, or the other. I don't try and do that too much with people. I just let the arguments speak for themselves. And when you are paying a high intellectual price to justify your position, and what I mean by that is if you're willing to embrace absurdity, to cling to what you have, then people can make a character judgment at that point or not. I don't know what is in Bart Ehrman's heart. I don't, for example, I know I'm picking on Bart a lot. He's the most popular New Testament critic that there is, right? And so they're saying goodbye. So they do this really long, loud goodbye thing. These nephews of mine. Anyway, but yeah, I don't know what's in his heart. I know that he gives his blog subscription money to the poor. That's really good of him. But I also feel like at times he's very dishonest. I know in his debate with Justin Bass, he said that if God exists, he couldn't break the laws of physics any more than he could break the laws of math, which is philosophically an indefensible position. It's just stupid. It's just stupid, to be completely frank. That even atheists who know a little bit more philosophy than Bart are like, Bart, that's dumb. So, could it be hard issues? I mean, I'm a Christian, so I believe that, like it or lump it, people are controlled by other factors, sin and spiritual death and other things. But like, I can't see those things. I don't really know. And they could psychoanalyze me too. And then we just psychoanalyze each other and we get nowhere. So I just prefer to keep it on the arguments as kind of a long-winded way of putting that out there, if that makes sense.
Yeah, we have a question from Wilsonian. I don't know if you're able to see it on the screen.
Sure.
I put it on. Yeah.
I want to ask you, we know that Eusebius quotes Papias about the Gotha authorship. How can we know that Eusebius didn't just make it up? Well, Eusebius also was pretty mean to Papias. And we have other fragments. We know about Papias from Irenaeus as well. So I don't think he's just inventing Papias and just saying Papias said these things. He's very demeaning to Papias. He doesn't really like Papias's view of the millennium. He has a different theology than him, and so he thinks he's kind of stupid. He also says that he spreads legends, and he does have that goofy story about Judas basically blowing up into a big ball and exploding, which obviously is not historically accurate. There's other problems with Papias as well. For example, he attributes a saying to Jesus of Jesus talking about talking grapes in the millennium or something like that. That I think most people would say, I don't think Jesus said that. And then he also attributes the fact. So I'm answering like the question, but I'm throwing other objections against Papias as well. That Matthew is originally written in Hebrew, but we know that Matthew is written in Greek. Well, we discussed this recently on a stream of mine with Stephen Boyce and David Paulman and Jonathan McClatchy. If people want to go back and watch that, they can. But basically, there's some dubiousness about Papias' source reliability that I'll go ahead and admit. But the whole idea that Matthew and Mark wrote a gospel isn't really that difficult to remember if it's some kind of oral tradition. And supposedly he was a disciple of a guy named John the Presbyter, who I think is probably John the Apostle. And so just because he garbled a few things, these are easier facts to remember as far as I'm concerned. But I don't think that our whole case of who wrote the Gospels is definitely just built on Papias and Irenaeus. So that was a long-winded answer that answered things that they weren't even asking. But yeah, and that's something I'll be making a video about in the near future and in more depth as far as gospel authorship and early attestation outside of those two guys.
Thank you for that, for the answer. I wanted to switch now to the most important portion of questions, and these have to do with the historical reliability of the Gospels. Do the Gospels verify or support what we know with the history outside of the Bible?
Yeah, I mean, majorly. I think that's one of the really strong points when you compare these Gospels to, say, the Apocryphal Gospels, as I already mentioned. So let me give you an example, right? There's different categories of evidence as far as external corroboration, but we'll talk about like specific locations and customs and culture, and I'll give a few examples. And so now, again, bear in mind that locations are hard. We're dealing with a world without Wikipedia. There was an absence of good maps. I already mentioned problems with some of the maps, just locating a little island of Cauda, with even somebody who is as well thought of as Ptolemy. There was a paucity of local libraries in the ancient world, and intimate knowledge of locations is evidence that the author either was an eyewitness or spoke to eyewitnesses, right? And so when skeptics say, well, they get these things wrong, you're saying that counts against evidence. So when they get things right, it has to count towards evidence. So one example is the pool of Bethesda. It says in John 5:2, it says, now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool, in Aramaic called Bethesda, which has 5 roofed colonnades. Now, there was a 18th century biblical critic named Loisy, who's fairly well known still among biblical scholars, who talks about the pool of Bethesda. And in one of his books, he said the ancients who hoped to find the source of Jewish symbol, and in the 5 porches an allusion to the 5 books of the law, undoubtedly discovered the thought of the evangelist. So in other words, Loisy is like, John's just making this up. This is just to symbolize, that he's a cripple, he's paralyzed under the law, and Jesus comes and takes away the law and makes him walk again. It's just, metaphorical or something like that. John is just making things up. Well, the problem with that is that archaeological work at the Pool of Bethesda in 1956 revealed that it was near the sheep gate, just as John said, surrounded by 4 roofed colonnades and spanned across the middle by a 5th. So archaeologists actually found this Pool of Bethesda with 5 covered colonnades. People can look that up. I have a video on the topic as well if they want to see a picture of it. But archaeology to the rescue showed, no, like this actually exists, right? Now, keep in mind, this isn't like, oh, they know where Jerusalem is. Okay, like big deal. Like that's the big city, right? That's like, I'm in Iowa, so it's like, okay, everybody knows Des Moines. But if I say, a smaller landmark in, I don't know, Marshalltown, that's a little more akin to what this would be. Okay. It's evidence that they were there. Okay. So that's just one example. Here's another example that I find to be really interesting. Is there was actually prejudice against Galileans. You remember the whole question, can anything good come out of Nazareth? I think that was Nathaniel's question, right? And then in John 7:42, there's this debate. Jesus is debating with the scribes and the teachers of the law, and they're like, "Oh, come on, surely the Christ." They're debating amongst each other at this point. And they're like, "Surely the Christ isn't going to come from Galilee, is he?" Right? And then another thing we see in Matthew 26, where Peter is about to deny Jesus, right? And he's warming himself by the fire. And, a servant lady's like, "Hey, aren't you one of his disciples?" And he's like, "No, I don't know him." They're like, "Oh, come on. Your accent gives you away." Right. So he's in Jerusalem at this particular time. These guys are Galileans, and he's saying, "You got a funny accent, right?" And so, surely you've never run into this in America. No, I'm just teasing you. Uh, I'm kidding. I'm in Missouri, I grew up in Missouri, so I heard all kinds of weird accents there, mostly from people who grew up in Missouri. But anyways, we actually can verify this detail in the Babylonian Talmud, right? And so this the funny way of them talking. Here's just a passage from the Talmud. This is Eruvin 53b. There was a certain woman who wanted to say to her friend, "My neighbor, whom I will feed you with milk," and it's like I don't know. I might be mispronouncing the Hebrew really bad there. However, due to the imprecise articulation of her words, she said to her neighbor, "My neighbor, may a lioness eat you?" And it sounded similar, like Takalik lava, right? But because their accent was so goofy and so garbled, right? Like it sounded like they were saying something funny. And we run into this kind of stuff all the time. And so the point is, this is like local knowledge, right? Later in the Talmud, you also hear this, them just talking about how Galileans were kind of lawless. They didn't really have high regard for the law like the people in Jerusalem did, and different stuff like that. And if you think about it, like in Acts 5:13, it says that they take note of, the disciples, that they were with Jesus or whatever. And they said that they were unlettered men. They were illiterate, right? They thought that they were illiterate. This is, people say, "Oh, that means they were illiterate." No, it just means that that's what they said. They thought about them, but they assume that because they're Galileans, right? And so we have a early source that confirms that people thought Galileans were backwards country bumpkins with funny accents, right? And so that I find to be, a really interesting kind of point of confirmation. Another one that I think is really interesting. This is again from the Talmud. It talks about when Jesus was going to raise the widow of Nain's son from the dead in Luke 17 or 7. It said there was a procession coming out of the city as Jesus and his followers drew near the gate. And then Jesus speaks to the mother, who is among the mourners first, and then he comes to the bier, what they're carrying this dead body in, on which the man's body had been laid. And in Judea, we actually know from the Talmud again, this is Shabbat 153, that mourners actually at that time, they would walk behind the bier in the procession, right? So this would be the wrong order in which Jesus would encounter them. Now, that might just be an oddity. It doesn't mean that like Luke was just making stuff up. We couldn't just say, just by that alone, Luke's making stuff up. But we actually know from the Talmud that in Galilee, in contrast to Judea, the mourners would walk in front of the bier. And so this is where Luke portrays Jesus, is exactly where he would be. Now, Luke, most people say, is a Gentile who was probably from Antioch. Like, how would he know this unless he's getting this information from eyewitnesses? Does that make sense? And so, and there's all kinds of details like this. There's another one. I might get some of the details fuzzy here, so bear with me. But a lot of times people will say, "Well, Herod, he never killed all those babies, after Jesus was born." I mean, that's just making stuff up. Josephus never corroborates that, so he couldn't have done that, right? Well, number one, that's an argument from silence. Okay, there's lots of things that Herod did that Josephus probably didn't record, and where Jesus was in Bethlehem, it's not a big town. We don't know how many children that it was. So we can't just assume that he's making it up. And we know Herod was super paranoid to where he would bump off his own family members if he had to, keep his stranglehold on the throne and all that other kind of stuff. And so, but we actually have some interesting corroboration. In Matthew 2:22, it talks about their returning from Egypt. And Joseph is like, they were going to return to Bethlehem, but then he goes up to Nazareth and they settle in Nazareth instead. Well, and it says the reason why he did that is he heard that Herod Archelaus was reigning on the throne in place of his father, Herod. And it's just like, okay, why does he even mention that? Well, Matthew never says why Joseph got freaked out by the whole idea of Herod Archelaus reigning on the throne. Well, in Josephus, I think it's Antiquity 17, and I could be wrong about this. I'll look it up in just a moment here and confirm it, or I'll look it up while I'm saying it. Herod Archelaus, there was some eagles, the Roman shield kind of things that were put in the temple, and the Jews got really upset about that. I'm looking up that reference there, and because they thought this is like idolatry, like we can't have this, and they got upset. Okay, and then later on, there was some Jews in the some Roman soldiers in the temple, and some Jews kind of got into it. They had words, and then some of the Jews, they got really angry and they stoned some of them to death. Well, Herod Archelaus had just come to the throne, and Josephus tells us that he kind of pulled a new sheriff routine, and he surrounded the temple with 3,000 men, including horsemen, and or not 3,000 men. They killed 3,000 men. There was a slaughter in the temple, and he canceled Passover, and he told everybody basically go home, and there ain't no Passover this year. So he flexed his muscles, and actually some of this stuff later got him in trouble when he was deposed in 6 AD. But anyways, the point is, you could imagine that there was people coming all over the diaspora, including Egypt, because we know that there was Jews that traveled to all these different feasts. Josephus tells us there's 1 million people that would come to Passover every year. He might have been exaggerating a little bit, but let's just say it's like 200,000. There were travelers going back from Egypt, surely, that Joseph would have met on the road, heard that Herod was reigning in his throne, his father's stead, heard about the slaughter. This was around the same time, most likely, heard about the slaughter and decided, you know what? We ran away from one homicidal maniac who was trying to kill my son. Let's not go back and live in the same town ruled by another homicidal maniac. Let's go up to Nazareth instead, where Archelaus didn't have jurisdiction. And so there's story after confirmation that we can find like this throughout the Gospels. And it just, again, shows that they're close up to the facts, knowledgeable, and were interested in telling the truth. That was Antiquity of the Jews 1793 is where that story comes from. It's just to get the reference. So there's other examples that I can give like that internally where the Gospels corroborate themselves. If you want, I can run through a few of those examples too.
Yeah, we still have almost 30 minutes left. So yeah, if you want, you can give a couple more examples. Thank you.
Sure. So I'm going to talk to you now about another line of evidence called undesigned coincidences. Okay. And I don't know if you've heard about undesigned coincidences or not before. But
I heard a couple of weeks ago from you.
Oh, okay. Great. No, this is great then. I'll kind of explain what it is, and then I'll give some examples. And so basically, there's 4 Gospels, but how can we tell by comparing 2 passages of Scripture that they're reliable, credible historical records? Well, the natural reply for a Christian is, well, we could find 2 different authors who tell us the same story, maybe in the same words, but come on, obviously the documents might have been copied from one another. And, they're going to say, well, of course, Mark came first and Luke and Matthew copied from Luke. And I'm not denying that there's some documentary dependence at all. I'm not denying that at all. But how can we find out if there's independent eyewitness evidence just on the basis of internal evidence alone? And so undesigned coincidences is a way to find this out. And so basically, one book may mention casually in passing a detail that answers some question that's raised by the other. That such interlocking would be highly improbable if one of them were purely copied from the other, or both were just purely copied from a common source, or a later book simply added a bunch of embellishments to the former. And so to illustrate this, and let me give you kind of like a real life example, okay? Say you go to a minor league baseball game, and a friend of yours was saying that, they met another friend there that you both know, and they were having a talk about, I don't know, something important while they were at the game. And one of the friends mentions that he caught a foul ball, and he's really excited. Like, I was there. It's the first time ever. I caught a foul ball. And the other guy mentions that he was at the game and his pants were just doused with beer. That somebody bumped into him and spilled beer all over him. And he was kind of like, didn't have as much fun because, you know, he was covered in beer. But these are two different stories from two different people. And they're not telling you the same story at the same time. You're hearing different stories at the same time. Well, if you think about it, a struggle over a foul ball could cause beer spilling, right? And if you're at a baseball game, people catch foul balls. And so one part that they didn't even mention, they didn't mention the whole story about the beer and the foul ball. They just kind of fill in one another and dovetail. Does that make sense? You following? Okay. And so it's their casualness, the casualness of these mentions that suggest that they didn't collude or fabricate their stories. And these indicate that they're not trying to create a specific impression or coordinate their statements. Okay. So what this casual interlocking shows is that this is what we would expect on eyewitness testimony, but fictions and forgeries, they don't interlock at all. Okay. This is the challenge that I've issued to skeptics. Go through the apocryphal stuff or go through fictional, goofy religious stories and see if you can find these kind of things. You're not going to find them. So one example, this is probably one of my favorite ones. There's a story in Mark's gospel where Herod is kind of freaked out about Jesus' ministry. He's just recently put to death John the Baptist, and now Jesus is running around, and he's like, what is this? John the Baptist come back from the dead? Is that why these miraculous powers are working in him? Okay, it talks about it in Mark, but in Matthew's gospel, it specifically said that Herod said this to his servants. Okay. Well, like, what the heck is going on there? Like, how would Matthew know what Herod is saying to his servants? We're not told. Is he just playing the role of omniscient narrator or what's going on? Is he just making this up? Is he just taking what Mark said and just adding an interesting detail about the servants? But it doesn't really move the needle on the story very much. So how would he know this detail? Well, Herod's question is explained when we turn over to Luke chapter 8, verse 3. Luke is not even talking about John the Baptist at all. It's not talking about John the Baptist's death at all. We don't get that until chapter 9. Completely unrelated story, has nothing to do with what's going on here. But Luke tells us that Jesus had some female followers who went and helped finance his ministry everywhere he went. And in Luke 8:3, he mentions one of their names, Joanna, the wife of Huzzah, Herod's household manager. So, that's how Matthew could have got that information. He has somebody that he knows, spouse, working in the high courts of Herod, so he would have been able to relay that information. But Matthew never mentions anything about Joanna. And again, like I said, Luke doesn't mention anything about this question to Herod and his servants. But both of these things dovetail with one another in a way that's completely undesigned, but has the ring of truth. Does that make sense so far? Okay. So now one of these could just be like an accident, like having two unrelated pieces of a jigsaw puzzle fall together just by chance. But the thing about the Gospels, and we also see this with Acts and Paul's letters, is that there's numerous undesigned coincidences that crisscross between each other and not any kind of developmental pattern that we would predict. And so it becomes kind of absurd to just say that they're all accidents, that these just happen to fit together. Like I said, you could have a jigsaw puzzle. You could put two random pieces that might fit together, but you can't put your whole puzzle together that way, right? And so it can't be just by accident. And these aren't in a way that's apparently designed. And so another example of this is, let's just say that you're inventing a miracle story, right? And you want to make up a story about Jesus that seems real, right? And your plan is to kick off the story by having Jesus ask a question to one of his disciples about money and bread, right? We're talking about the feeding of the 5,000, obviously. So who do you pick? If Jesus is going to turn to somebody and ask somebody a question, well, who's the most talkative disciple in all the Gospels, right? It's Peter, right? Or who would know something about money? Well, maybe Judas because he had the money bag, or Matthew because he was a tax collector. But no, John 6:5 says that Jesus turned to Philip and said he saw the large crowd coming to him, and he turns to Philip and said, "Where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat?" This is John 6:5. So, like, why Philip? Philip is mentioned a handful of times in John's gospel, but he only talks 3 times. Okay. He's a very, very minor character in John's gospel. Well, what's interesting is that Luke and John incidentally fill in the details. That was a bad Phil pun, Philip. Anyways, I'm a dad. I make the dad jokes. But anyways, Luke 9:10-11, we find out that the feeding of the 5,000 takes place in Bethsaida, right? So Luke tells us that the feeding of the 5,000 happens in Bethsaida. But John does not tell us where the feeding of the 5,000 happens. But John, in a completely unrelated passage, not even trying to explain the feeding of the 5,000 or anything going on with the backstory with Philip in terms of this story, just in an unrelated passage, mentions that Philip was from Bethsaida. Now it makes sense, right? If you're looking to feed a bunch of people, and of course, Jesus's question, it just was kind of rhetorical. He was testing Philip, but you're going to turn to the local guy and you're going to ask him, "Hey, where can we buy bread so that these people can eat?" Right? Philip knows the local shops, right? And so now the question makes sense. And so if Bethsaida influenced John's account, he probably would have been much more likely to mention the town directly than to create a question with Philip. Mentioning a question to Philip without referencing the town would be an extremely indirect way to convey Philip's connection to Bethsaida. This improbability increases if John invented Philip's link to Bethsaida in other parts of his gospel. And so now what's interesting is that another example from the feeding of the 5,000, there's several undesigned coincidences in this particular story, is in Mark's gospel. Jesus is trying to get away from everybody. And he says, "Come away by a desolate place and rest for a while. For there were many coming and going, and they had no leisure to eat." So he tells us that there was a bunch of people coming and going. And then in verse 39, he mentions that the grass was green, right? So he had the groups of people sit down in the green grass. So if you actually look at like rainfall precipitation, there's a smallish window of when the grass is actually green in Palestine at this particular time. Most of the time it was brown, right? And so Mark tells us there was crowds and there was green grass, so we can kind of guess that it was springtime. Well, John, without mentioning the green grass at all, mentions that the feeding of the 5,000 in John 6:4 says, "Now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, is at hand. Here is a boy who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they among many?" And so he mentions that it was Passover and that there was a boy there that had barley loaves. Well, Passover is in the middle of the short growing season in Palestine. It's also the great feast where thousands of Jews flocked every year. And so John, without mentioning the big crowds, really, coming and going, going back and forth, and without mentioning the green grass, mentions that it was Passover. And Passover is also the time of the barley harvest. The kid had barley loaves, right? And so these, 2 small details interlock in 2 ways with Mark's account of the same event, but they're not doing it in this obvious way that like John's like, "Hey, I'm really sneakily trying to improve on Mark's story and filling it with all these other details, but I'm going to leave all these other details out." Like that doesn't really make sense. And so there's all these different interlockings, right? Another one that I think is kind of interesting, and I'll just give one more example here that has to do with the feeding of the 5,000, is Jesus talks about woes to Bethsaida, right? He goes in Matthew 11:21, he says, "Woe to you, Chorazin! Woe to you, Bethsaida! For if the mighty works had been done in you, in Tyre and Sidon, you would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes." But if you're just reading Matthew's gospel at that particular time, Matthew hasn't even reported what mighty works even happened in Bethsaida, right? And so it's kind of like, what is going on? Like, why is Jesus taking the gloves off and ripping into Bethsaida? It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. But again, we find out that the miracle happened in Bethsaida, and Matthew, who often organizes his story by theme instead of in a chronological order, presents the feeding of the 5,000 in chapter 14. It's only when we compare Luke's account that we realize that the feeding happened before Jesus pronounced woes over Bethsaida, right? And what's interesting, and this is the last little scriptural nugget I'll give you here, is Mark mentions that there was a blind guy in Bethsaida. If you remember, there's this really weird story where he heals the guy and he's like, I see men walking like trees, like he lays hands on him, or maybe he spits on him. I can't remember. Yeah, he spit on his hand, spit in his eyes. And then he's like, I see men walking like trees. Then he does it again and the guy can see. Well, he says that they came to Bethsaida. He took the man out of Bethsaida. And then he said, don't even enter into the village after he healed him. And so obviously he really meant those woes because he didn't want him to go back. But notice Mark doesn't tell us that the feeding of the 5,000 happened in Bethsaida. He doesn't tell us that the woes happened in Bethsaida. And so these, again, are all these little details that dovetail with one another that I think is best explained on the hypothesis that what we have here is eyewitness testimony, rather that these are just late embellishments. Embellished stories don't interlock in this seamless, undesigned, casual way. They usually go out of their way to kind of show like, hey, you know, I'm fitting this together. I'm harmonizing this. Can't you see that? And so does that make sense? Does that interest, you know, kind of?
It does for me as a lover of details, facts, as a biblical nerd. I love these details. I enjoy them.
Yeah. And so I think this is a very powerful, you know, argument. And again, there's examples, numerous examples between Paul's letters and Acts where we see this. I'll just give you one right off the top of my head with Acts. So Paul is a tent maker. He's hanging out with Priscilla and Aquila in Corinth in Acts chapter 18, right? And then it says, all of a sudden, in verse 5, he talks about he devoted himself to the word full time. He just basically quit making tents. He quit just preaching on the Sabbath only in the synagogues only. And all of a sudden, he went preaching full time. And it said that he did it when the brothers from Macedonia came. That's it. What are the brothers from Macedonia coming have anything to do at all with Paul all of a sudden stopping making tents with Priscilla and Aquila to fund himself to just preaching full time? Like, is he just a slacker? You know, did he just get tired of making tents? Was he like, this sucks, I'm going to go do something more fun and hopefully some offerings will come in? Like, what's going on? Well, in 2 Corinthians 11, let me just look it up real quick. It's 11:8. It says, I robbed other churches by receiving support from them. Am I finding the right one? Let me look it up here. Let me just look up chapter 11. Yeah, I robbed other churches receiving support for them. And when I was with you and needed something, I was not a burden to anyone. For the brothers who came from Macedonia supplied what I needed. Okay. And so, but like, he doesn't say anything about he was making tents and then he just quit. So again, these are things that are just subtle. They interlock. They have the ring of truth. They're not something you'd find in fictions and forgeries. It's not explained. These details are left out, but then this other one just kind of comes in and coincides. And you see this over and over again with Paul's letters and Acts and between the Gospels. So yeah, plus that with all the external corroborations, you know, I just gave you a taste. There are dozens of these, and there are books that I can recommend where people can study this argument more that make me say, okay, this goes back to what the original eyewitnesses claimed. And so why do they make these claims in front of a hostile audience?
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed all of these. And I hope that the audience, especially skeptics, will take this to heart and consider them that this is too much to be just a mere coincidence.
Yeah.
Erik, before I ask you the final, to me, the most interesting question about Jesus being a copycat, I have few short questions. Maybe you can dedicate a couple of sentences to each of these because I want to respect your time. So I'll just ask you quick few questions. The first one is, what do the skeptics think that the first century eyewitness accounts from the apostles and disciples brought to them? Because it certainly, as we know, it wasn't fame, it wasn't fortune and wealth. It brought them nothing but famine, brought them nothing by imprisonment, persecution, and finally death. Do you find this argument when skeptics are attacking historical reliability of the Gospels by imposing some supposedly conspiracy that the apostles wanted to, invent all these things, but we know that it didn't turn, it did not turn out well to be for the apostles.
Sure. And so I think this is where, like, I would say William Paley's trilemma comes into effect, where um, up to this point, what I've argued is that the Gospels and Acts go back to what the original eyewitnesses were claiming. Well, what were they claiming according to the Gospels and Acts? That Jesus, it wasn't just some fuzzy Jesus that they saw for a few seconds and could have been easily mistaken about seeing, like some sort of grief hallucination or something like that. No, it was somebody that they ate with. It was somebody that they had meals with. It was somebody that they touched aside. And, there was group appearances. They met in the day. They met behind closed doors. They met in outside. There was conversations. This is over a period of 40 days, according to Luke. That's not something you could be easily mistaken about. And so I think lies is actually your best option, because if these do go back to what the witnesses claim, this is what they claimed, that this is what they saw. But you're right. It doesn't make any sense for them to make these claims before a hostile audience. It doesn't make any sense, And so I think this is why I think skeptics get this. And this is why they try and separate the Gospels and go, no. Like, all you got is Paul, and 1 Corinthians 15 is just a creed that tells us about appearances. And there's no details to those appearances. Those could be anything. People see weird stuff and claim to see weird stuff all the time, and they're mistaken all the time. I don't think they want to attribute lies, because I think they know that the apostles were probably, for the most part, sincere. They definitely would say that Paul was sincere. I think that most of them believe that Peter was very sincere. And so, if you can defend Acts, then you can defend the apostles' willingness to suffer alongside, with that. So yeah, I think it's an important point. Also, if Luke was a traveling companion with Paul, then there's two things. One, he was also willing to suffer, because he's traveling with a guy that's constantly getting chased from town to town. And then two, Luke gives us details about what Paul's conversion was like, his blindness for a period of time, his companions hearing a voice, the different sensory details that are involved there. And he also tells us what the apostles were preaching, which was a physically raised Jesus. So it's doubtful that Paul's message and Luke's message are different if they're traveling companions. And it's obvious that they were doing this in front of a hostile audience. So I think lies is just completely improbable, because they gained absolutely nothing. And you just have to be incredibly cynical. Again, you're paying the intellectual price, as I mentioned earlier, at that point. If that's what you're willing to resort to, is it's more likely that they were lying and willing to get themselves, basically chased from town to town and beaten, and undergo labors and dangers and sufferings and even martyrdom in some cases, for just something that they didn't sincerely believe at all. That just stretches credulity. I think a miracle is a far better explanation than that. And if that's what your philosophy leads you to push you towards, then the problem to me is with your philosophy at that point.
Yeah, and I mean, if I was one of the apostles back then, I surely would not want to write embarrassing details about myself, denying Jesus, being told by Jesus, get behind me, Satan, being aggressive when, cutting someone's ear and then Jesus trying me to calm down, or pointing out that females were the first eyewitnesses of Jesus' resurrection, because as we know, in that time, in that culture, women's testimony, especially in the court of law, was not very valid. I would not come up with so many things. I would not put that, some of the disciples did not want to believe that Jesus came back to life, and so on and so on and so on. I know that I wouldn't, if I was about to invent with my friends or with my partners, if I was about to invent some story, I would try to make myself look better. And disciples, most of them, in different situations throughout the gospel, they fail. So this is, I think, a huge bonus, a huge evidence for Christianity and for the Gospels, that because of these embarrassing details, they portray and depict a true story.
Yeah, I would say embarrassment does count as some evidence for reliability for sure. Again, everything that we've said here, somebody could say, well, these are just kind of small chips, you know. But the thing is if you just keep adding chip after chip after chip, pretty soon you have a pretty big pile. And I think a lot of times this is where skeptics get confused, is they think like in order to have a strong case for Christianity, you need just this one knockdown piece of evidence that just overwhelms the prior probability of a miracle, which is low. You know, it's okay to admit that to a certain extent. I wouldn't, anyway, that's a whole other discussion. I don't think that the prior to a miracle is really that low, but regardless, it's lower than a mundane claim, obviously. So, but the point, what I'm trying to say is that with little pieces, if you put enough little pieces together, they can equal one large, impressive piece. And you think about the way that even we do court cases, a lot of times it's the circumstantial little things that cause one to convict, right? And so yeah, I would say that embarrassing details, like you mentioned there, particularly the women being discoverers of the empty tomb, there's pushback that skeptics can give on that can be somewhat reasonable. There's a lot of embarrassing details, like you mentioned, though. Generally, you don't try and make the leader of your group look like a doofus, the way that they do with Peter. And that's also an interesting point, too, with Peter, the embarrassing details. Peter has a real foot and mouth syndrome. And you see that consistent portrayal in the Gospels over and over and over again, no matter which Gospel that it is. I think that this character portrayal of Peter, again, is more probable that this is eyewitness testimony than these are a bunch of embellished stories, because you see this very consistent picture of Peter throughout. And you see that with other figures in the Gospels as well. Like even Jesus between John. A lot of times people say, well, John's Jesus is so different than the synoptics, but yet John's Jesus makes puns and is sarcastic and is witty, you know, and they have these little characteristics that are the same. Or even like Mary and Martha in the story in Luke and in the story of Mary and Martha that we see in John, there's a lot of like similar characteristics. And so I think these similar personality traits, including Peter's embarrassing personality traits, give us a unified view of the characters, which gives us a unified view of the authors. Again, that they're trying to be honest and get it right, and that they really were close up to the events that they were reporting.
Eric, should we as believers be concerned when Bartman, whom you mentioned a couple of times, comes and says that despite the Jews were known as someone who were very good in memorizing stories and having a very well developed oral tradition, when someone like him comes and says, yes, but still we don't have the original manuscripts because, as we know, they were destroyed over time. We have copies of the copies of the copies of the copies, and this is one of his continual and constant attacks on Christianity, that he says, yeah, but we have late generations of manuscripts. And I think I wrote it down that the earliest piece or a fragment we have to these days called P52. It's a fragment of John,
yeah.
from the first half of the 2nd century, and that's only a small portion.
All
other fragments and portions and manuscripts we have came a little bit later. So should we be concerned when Bart comes and says, yeah, but we have copies of the copies of the copies of the copies, so therefore we cannot trust that we have the genuine words of the Jesus and the apostles?
No, I don't think so at all. And I think for the reasons that I've given, that we don't need to worry about that. If all we had were copies of copies of copies of copies, and they were just all these different, everything got garbled over time, then we wouldn't expect the interlocking details that I mentioned there bear the witness of eyewitness testimony, whether it's to the external history that we can verify, like I said, either in Josephus or the Talmud or different things like that, or with each other. And so No, I don't think so at all. I think if that was the case, then we would not expect to see the things that we see in the Gospels. But or if there are oral traditions even that are just like the telephone game analogy that he likes to use. Well, if you have the telephone game analogy, you're not going to get the kind of details that I'm talking about. And so I would say that the stuff that I'm bringing forward, this positive case that I'm bringing forward, is what we wouldn't expect. Now they would say, well, yeah, but we would expect to see, I don't know, contradictions or something like that. But we already talked about that. Most of the contradictions, like I said, that are brought up are pretty weak, or at best might indicate a good faith error, which is expected in any sort of eyewitness testimony. It doesn't mean that it doesn't count at all against historicity, but it's just weaker. And so, no, I don't think that's a problem really at all. Because this is why I'm more interested in what did the documents say and how can we corroborate them than I am with the manuscript stuff, because this is where the real action is. Because I can see that this is eyewitness testimony from multiple lines of evidence. You know, the unified personalities that I just touched on, undesigned coincidences that I touched on, the external confirmations that I touched on. So I think it's a point, an adventure in missing the point in a way. It's a distraction. So it's kind of a red herring. It's like big whoop-de-doo. Like, well, what if all we did have is have copies of copies of copies, which is true. We already know what Ehrman says. Like, you're going to agree. In the end, he's going to agree with Professor Metzger, who's a Christian. So I don't know. I find this to be one of the most lame of atheist memes out there. That just is a real shallow understanding of really the documents that we actually have.
Erik, here comes the question of all the questions for tonight.
Okay.
When I was a newcomer to the United States, I heard about this documentary called The Zeitgeist that was extremely popular back in the days.
I've never actually watched Zeitgeist, but I know enough about it. Go ahead.
Yeah. When I watched it, I mean, it's not just religious, it was also political and stuff like that, which are really not something that interests me.
Yeah.
But in that documentary, a portion was dedicated to prove that Jesus was just a copycat of earlier dying and rising mythological saviors and divine figures, and that even if Jesus did exist, he surely wasn't divine. But if we would compare the stories coming from pagan literature, we see that there are many figures supposedly coming before Jesus through the virgin birth, having 12 disciples, being killed, resurrected, and so on and so on. And again, like an hour ago, I mentioned that when I was an early Christian, some other things bugged me, and they were making me, almost not lose my faith, but cause a lot of doubt. So this was another big point of my life when, until I found answers, it caused me seriously doubting and being anxious about my faith until I dig more and bought books, listened to YouTube videos. But you can take as much time as you have. Please tell us, is Jesus just a copycat of earlier mythological divine figures?
Well, yeah, I mean, to me, this is one of the most silly objections, and I'm kind of surprised that it seems to, after I thought it was dead, seems to be resurfacing again by people who really should know better, who are popularizers on the internet. And I think it's silly in a number of different ways, but in a way, I'll give it some credit. This is kind of what C.S. Lewis was a hang up for him. He said that when he was an atheist, he wrote a letter that says, often great men are regarded as gods after their death, such as Hercules and Odin. So after the death of a Hebrew philosopher named Yeshua, whose name we've now corrupted into Jesus, he was seen as a god, leading to the rise of the cult connected to the ancient Hebrew Yahweh worship, thus giving birth to Christianity, one mythology among many, but one that we happen to be brought up in. Well, C.S. Lewis later actually read the Gospels, and had some interesting conversations with his friend Tolkien at Oxford. Later, in an essay called Fern Seeds and Elephants, he says that I've been reading poems, romances, vision literature, legends, myths all my life. I know what they're like. I know not one of them is like this. Of this text, there are either two possible explanations. Either this is reportage, though it may no doubt contain some errors pretty close to the facts, nearly as close as Boswell, or else some unknown writer in the 2nd century without any known predecessors or successors suddenly anticipated the whole technique of modern novelistic realistic narrative. If it is untrue, it must be a narrative of that kind. The reader who doesn't see this simply has not learned to read. And so Lewis is not pulling any punches. He's just basically like, you have absolutely zero reading comprehension skills if you can't see that. When it comes to looking at the parallels, obviously Zeitgeist is like the lowest of low-hanging fruit. The parallels are bad, like Mithras was born of a rock, not a virgin, and stuff like that. You could go on and on and on. Most of the time when you look at these parallels, they're very disinteresting. Like they're bad parallels. There's not a really clear connection at all. Second of all, as I said earlier, and just as from reading the quote from Lewis, this is reportage. This is historical narrative. That Luke is saying that he's reporting historical narrative. John is saying that I'm a witness to these things. They're claiming to be witnesses, okay? They involve real people. We have Caiaphas's ossuary, for crying out loud. I mean, we have the Pilate stone. We know these people actually existed. We know Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate because we read about it in Tacitus. And so it's silly. It's nonsense. It's ridiculous. It doesn't understand the genre of the Gospels. It doesn't have any appreciation of the historical details in the Gospels. And yeah, it's just, I don't, you look at the actual parallels that these people offer, most of the time it's pretty spurious. But let's just say that there are some half decent parallels, some decent parallels. Some scholars say, well, the Gospels, they're not copying pagan myths, but maybe they're copying Jewish stories, like we talked about the feeding of the 5,000. Well, maybe that Elisha fed 100 people with a handful of bread. Maybe the gospel writers are just saying that he's cooler than the prophet Elisha. Well, if God is the author of the story, why can't he choose to parallel something if he wanted to? How can you rule that out? How can you, right? If God is creating a story and he wants it to appeal to Jews and pagans, then he can make a story if he wanted to that's going to stick out to Jews and pagans. The parallels that people are choking on are often miracles. Bacchus supposedly turned water into wine. Well, no, he didn't. He had wine miracles, but he never turned water into wine. But, what if God just decided, you know what? I'm going to troll Bacchus. Jesus is cooler because I decided to. And it's not just actual invention, right? Parallels by themselves don't tell you anything. That's a post hoc fallacy. Just because something came before, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's derived from that. You actually have to show a connection. And even if there was a connection, you have to talk about what kind of literature this is. And you can't rule out that God might be being like, I'm going to one up this particular story, right? You guys have weird birth narratives. Well, bam, virgin birth. I don't care. You know what I mean? And so you're going to say Romulus ascended into heaven? Well, guess what? So did Jesus, whatever. And so if God is an agent and he wants to do these things to create a story that appeals to these people, you can't rule that out. And so what you have to do is you have to say, okay, when did these reports actually come out? Were they reports made by witnesses, or are they just legends that were made up long, long ago, way after the events, far, far away in fantasy land? And were these events that were initially reported, were they something that were just like widely received among people, or did they actually have some resistance to them and then have to, was there a context of persecution in bringing forward these stories? And you have to look at different things like that. And there's obviously no clear motives. And so, because if God is going to work a miracle, it's going to have this air of mythicalness to us. It just is, right? Just because like Asclepius supposedly healed people. Well, if Jesus heals people, of course, like it's going to sound like Asclepius, because Asclepius supposedly miraculously healed people, right? Asclepius opened the eyes of the blind. Well, I guess Jesus can't do blind eyes. All right, I guess that's off limits, because you don't want to get accused of borrowing from the myths of Asclepius. Give me a break. Like, what exactly is God supposed to do if there's all these myths and legends about all these different kind of miracles? Like, what does he do? Well, Romulus ascended into heaven, so I guess Jesus, you're not allowed to do that. You gotta, shrink down like Ant-Man and disappear into the quantum realm. Be original. Come on, don't, if who did I say? Bacchus turned water into wine, or Dionysus, whatever. I think they're the same guy. Well, you can't have any wine miracles because they already did that. It's just like, what is he supposed to do? Like turn the water into Baja Blast Mountain Dew at the wedding? Like, really impress people? Do something that's way technologically advanced? I don't know. Maybe it sounds silly what I'm saying here, but because this whole stuff is silly. Parallels mean nothing. They don't mean anything against historicity. You have to actually look at the documents to determine historicity. And you can't rule out that God exists if he just wanted to parallel, even granting all their points, even granting that they look exactly alike, which they don't. If you look at them again, they're pretty spurious. That doesn't. So what? The Titanic. There is a fictional story, the sinking of the Titan, that happened.
I was about to mention this. Thank you.
20 years before the Titanic. It talks about people hitting an iceberg in the Atlantic in a big ocean cruise liner, and it looks exactly the same, and people still think, what are you, like Nostradamus or something, dude? Like, people were suspicious over this guy. There's all those parallels between Abraham Lincoln and John F. Kennedy that are really spooky. Like, people find patterns and see parallels in all kinds of things. That doesn't mean anything. Like, I could pick up parallels between Alexander the Great and Napoleon if I wanted to. So what? Like, that doesn't mean that there's no historicity. So anyways, that was a soapbox. I probably answered that longer than I needed to, but yeah, parallels mean diddly squat. They can count as some evidence against historicity, but you have to look at everything. You have to look at the entire picture. You can't just look and say parallel, therefore fiction. You have to look at all of the evidence that's on the table.
Hey, thank you so much for that. I just want to mention, for example, when I was struggling with this, one of the people who helped me, well, not him personally, but his YouTube channel was Michael Jones, and his Inspiring Philosophy channel. He would dedicate each video to another deity, including Dionysus, whom you mentioned, and he would be like, "Hey, is it true what atheists are claiming, that this figure is resembling Jesus? Well, actually, let's go to the original text." And he would dissect everything. And it turned out in most of these, if not all of these cases, they're like maybe one or two resemblances, and that's it. Everything else was just exaggerated. So his work helped me. I can just say, to the audience, you can support, just subscribe to his channel, as well as subscribing to Erik Manning's channel. I had provided in the video description links that lead to Erik's work. Subscribe, spread the word, help him financially if you can. And also at the end, I wanted to mention, I wish Jesus can come and turn my water into some expensive German or Dutch beer. That would be amazing if he can do that for me.
Well, there you go. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, you could try. I've heard a friend of mine. I heard a story of a minister who was like, he was drunk on the plane and he was afraid that the minister was going to turn his beer into water, but that would be kind of the miracle and the opposite there. So anyway, yeah, no, I appreciate it. And Michael is a friend of mine, so I definitely recommend his videos on all the different pagan parallels and stuff like that. So
yeah. Erik, thank you for everything. Thank you for finding time for us. I really enjoyed. We learned a lot. I'm excited that this video will be available, hopefully even for generations to come, so they can learn a lot from you. I wish all the best, not just to you personally, but also to your ministry, because you publish all those and post all those videos. They are full with information. You give data. Again, you're helping all of us to learn more and not just to have blind faith. And I just, again, want to invite everyone to support Erik. Links would be found under the video. Erik, thank you so much. God bless you, and maybe we'll have something similar next year.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Take care.